This past summer, when I turned 60, I developed an intense fascination with my grandfather, with my mother's father, Will Bloom. It's not just that I'm named for him. He's Will and I'm Wes. I carry his Hebrew name, Yechiel Shneur. The connection is actually much deeper than that. My grandfather, Will Bloom, in the last season of his life, the last few years of his life, was a traveling salesman. And he would drive hundreds of miles every week from town to town, calling on customers, trying to make sales calls. He was the embodiment of Willie Loman. In fact, the pathos of his life and of his end was so much that my mother could never watch Death of a Salesman. One day, my grandfather died alone on the road in a single car accident. His death was sudden, and it was inexplicable, and it was never quite clear exactly what happened. Did he fall asleep at the wheel? Did he intend to take his own life? We never knew. But one thing that did happen for sure was that when my mother got the call out of the clear blue sky that her father had died alone on the road in a single car accident in unexplained circumstances, when she got that call, the one thing that was clear was she wanted to bring new life into the world so that she could name this new life after her father. And that would turn out to be me. Now, the decision to have another child at that point in my parents' life was totally implausible. They already had 5 children, a very small house, 1 bathroom, and no money. And the last thing they needed was another hungry mouth to feed, and my mother was already 36 years old. But that's how much she wanted to have a name for her father, that despite all that, she brought me into the world. So in a very real way, my grandfather's death and my life are intertwined. If he had not died the way he died, then I would never have been born. And he died at the age of 60. So when I turned 60, I just developed this curiosity. What was he doing? Why was he on the road? Why was my grandfather Willie Loman? Why was he driving all those hundreds of miles alone? So I called his only surviving child, my Aunt Evie, who is in her 80s, living in Pennsylvania. She's the last survivor of that generation. And I said, Evie, could you tell me about your dad? Could you tell me about my grandfather? What was he doing on the road in the last season of his life? And she said, well, I could tell you, but I actually just discovered a treasure trove of letters that he wrote in the last year of his life by hand. He wrote them to your mother. I don't even know why I have them, but if you're interested, I'm happy to send them to you. So I said, of course. So one day, I get these letters from my grandfather, written to my mother in the mail. And they were all written in the last year of his life. They were written in 1959. He would die on the road in the summer of 1960, and I would be born in the summer of 1961. Now, reading these letters, they just had so much pathos to them. First of all, there's the pathos of living on the road, of driving hundreds of miles. My grandfather would describe in these letters that he's driving from North Dakota to Montana to Utah to Nevada. And he didn't have a Lexus, and he wasn't driving a Tesla. He was driving a 1950s car. He didn't have GPS, he didn't have Waze, he didn't have any navigational technology. He had a map, and he was all alone. And then there's a lot in these letters about weather and winter weather, that it's snowing, there's a snowstorm, there's an ice storm, it's misty, it's foggy, and he has to drive all these miles in all this weather. There's a lot in these letters about loneliness, because he goes from town to town. All of these letters are stationary from different hotels, and he doesn't know anybody in those towns but the client that he calls on. When the client call is done, he goes to the hotel. He's all alone. There's no email, there's no text, there's no cell phone, there's no Zoom, there's no FaceTime. He just never sees his family. The closest that he gets to a family member is writing a letter. So there's loneliness, nobody to ask him at the end of the day, how was your day? And then there's just weariness, just another day, another drive, another client, another hotel. So I'm reading these letters just as I turned 60. And I realized for the first time in my life, I'm reading these about my grandfather in his 60th year, right before he died, that the person that I am named for and the person whose death resulted in my life suffered so much in the last year of his life. Far from home, far from family, far from hope. Now, why in the world am I telling you this? And why am I telling you this on all days on Yom Kippur? Everybody's Yom Kippur is about them. What does any of this have to do with any of you? And the answer is an iconic line in Hamilton. History has its eyes on you. History has its eyes on you. Means that one fine day, maybe not today or tomorrow, but one fine day, your descendants, your biological descendants, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, or your spiritual descendants, your students or the students of your students, your disciples or the disciples of your disciples, are going to develop an intense curiosity about you. When the chips were down, how were you? When the going got tough, how were you? What kind of challenges did you face? And how did you face those challenges? And is the way that you faced your challenge in your season of challenge going to be a role model? Do I want to emulate that if I'm a future generation? And that will happen. People will be looking for your letters. And it's fashionable to say that we live in a challenging time. That's obviously true. But it is also true that every generation lives in a challenging time, because that is the human condition. The human condition is challenge. Now, there doesn't need to be an Olympics of suffering. Which generation had it harder? Every generation lives in its own unprecedented times. We, of course, know the travails of multiple waves of COVID. But I bet that if you were to look at the lives of your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, of your teachers, you would find plenty of challenge there too. And here's the thing. It's what we do in the challenging seasons that so much defines our legacy. It's the character that we show or do not show. The courage that we show or do not show. The resilience that we show or do not show, that makes our life, that makes your life, a legacy that your descendant will want to claim or not want to claim. It's what we do now. It's what you do now that will define the legacy that your descendant will choose to embrace if they are inspired by it. In other words, when Lin-Manuel Miranda says history has its eyes on you, he's not only talking about George Washington, he's talking about you. Which means that the question on this Yom Kippur day is very simply this: will the life that I am living now be an inspiration to my descendants? Will the life that I am living now be an inspiration to my descendants? And here's the really good news. There are two ways to win this. If the answer to that question is yes, my descendants would see what I'm doing and they'd be moved by it, great. Keep it up. Keep going, don't stop. But if in your reflections under this tent on Yom Kippur, if you think, you know what, not so much, then you can change it. You're in the middle of your story, and you have agency, and you can now shape a different kind of story that your descendants would be moved by. And if you do that, that's a double blessing and a double inspiration. One, that you grew, that you changed, that you evolved, that you deepened. And two, that you were able to summon the courage and resilience and character in a later chapter that you had not been able to summon originally. And that's precisely the trajectory that my grandfather embraced and embodied, which is why his story speaks so loudly to me now. Why was my grandfather reduced to writing these letters to my mother in 1959, the year before he died in a single car accident on the road? What was he doing there? And the answer is he had no choice. And the reason is that he had had a severe gambling addiction that caused major distress to his family, major distress in his marriage, major harm to my mother and to her sisters, to my grandfather's children. And he had a good job and a stable job in Denver where he lived. And he lost it as a casualty of his gambling addiction. So he did the Willie Loman thing to try to earn a living for his family. Now, we adults, we human beings, we break things sometimes. That's what we do. We disappoint the people who count on us sometimes. That's what we do. We sometimes hurt most the people that we love most. That is sometimes what we do. And then the question is, when we break it, do we try to mend it? When we break it, do we do our best to repair it? And the Talmud actually teaches in the Tractate Brachot that the penitent, the person who just went off course, who did the wrong thing, who had the gambling addiction in my grandfather's case, the penitent who tried to repair their damage stands in a higher place than the person who never sinned at all. So that was what my grandfather was doing in the road. He was trying to take responsibility for his life, to fix his mistakes. A very hard lesson to live. A crucial lesson to teach. I'm proud to bear his name. But our question now, every one of our question now is, will the life that I am living now be an inspiration to my descendants? Because history has its eyes on you. And if the answer to that question is yes, keep it up. And if the answer to that question is no, change it up. Because one thing is clear, and one thing is certain, that as we live and breathe, every one of us is drafting a letter to our posterity, and the pen is in your hands.